Thank you for such a warm welcome, and let me extend my greetings to the people of the world out there who are joining us tonight, especially those of you in Australia, India, hi Sonal, California, US. I am pleased, thrilled, happy to talk to you about this book, The Dawning of the Theosophical Movement, that came out 25 years ago, because this book was actually born here in the headquarters of the Theosophical Society in America. I had come back from doing research in the archives at Adyar in 1984. It was spring of '85. And I was downstairs having lunch. Dora Kunz was the president then, and Shirley Nicholson was sitting with me. She was the editor of the Theosophical Publishing House. And Dora, being Dora, turned to me and she said, "Well, you've been to Adyar, why don't you write a book?" Now, I had written some articles, but the idea of doing a book, I must admit, was kind of daunting. But when Dora spoke, you listened. Dora really had this ability to really see potential in people. This was her great character. This, by the way, is the same Dora Kunz who, when I asked her once, was she at that famous 1925 convention at Adyar where Krishnamurti was speaking under the banyan tree and moved from speaking in the third person to the first person about the world teacher. After 4 hours with her, she stopped and looked at me and she says, "Well, when I tell you these things at my age, it's not gossip, it's history." She was already in her 90s, and it certainly gave me a different basis on looking at history. So tonight, it's not gossip, it's history. Or perhaps maybe it might be gossip and not history. But when we come to approaching the history of our movement, which is really a remarkable and wonderful thing, I always feel like those people who are on Antiques Roadshow and somebody brings them something precious and they don't realize how wonderful it is. Our history is truly a remarkable and wonderful thing. And I want to give you a quote from Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche. And he starts out in one of his books, he says, "A well-known saying in Tibet states, one should explain the lineage and the history in order to cut doubt about the authenticity of the teaching and the transmission. One should explain the lineage and the history in order to cut doubt about the authenticity of the teaching and transmission." And what is our history but a lineage, a transmission? It is the thing that makes us Theosophists. We talk about a philosophy, but there are many people who have similar ideas, but it is our history, it is our lineage, and it is our tradition that truly makes us Theosophists. I hope you agree with this. So this little book deals with how Theosophy started in America. The title was given by Pete Peterson, who was the manager of the Theosophical Publishing House at the time. I can't even remember what the title was. I have a vague feeling it was How Theo Met Sophie, but I may be wrong on this point. But let us look at how we approach history. What is the many ways of just simply looking at theosophical history? Well, first, you will find there are a lot of people who simply say it's an out-and-out fraud and there's just no need in even discussing it or talking about it, right? There's no discussion with those people because they simply dismiss it. Secondly, there are people who think it's just evil. It's part of Satan's ploy to corrupt humanity, and in fact, the latest emphasis is Blavatsky was Hitler's stooge. So this is another area also. Third, we can say there are a group of people who believe, yes, she tricked, but she really had some interesting ideas. One of the comments I saw referred to her as a ballsy broad from the Ukraine. Right? So, yeah, this is the way the intelligentsia tends to look at her. Yeah, she may have tricked and all this, but she really had some interesting ideas. Fourthly, we can say that we can approach Theosophy as Blavatsky being a cultural icon. That is, her teachings had an enduring cultural impact on modern philosophy. She really was a great cultural icon. There are many of you who are familiar with that cover of Sgt. Pepper's that has, by the Beatles, that have all the characters in it. I think if it was being redone today, she would certainly be up there. Then there are people who feel that really she is part of the modern spiritual heritage that we know of. I refer to this as sort of the seeker mentality, that Blavatsky is part of this wonderful spiritual tradition and heritage that we have gotten. Sixth, there is the theosophical view, which is she was what she says she was. That's it, right? She was what she said she was. And then lastly, this sort of New Age approach that she revealed the inner government of the world, and much of the teachings you will find in a lot of New Age teaching. But this book, in turn, started to really look at the movement, how it came together. There had been no individual study of the origins of the movement since Colonel Olcott's old diary leaves in the 1890s. Can you imagine? There had been no investigation of the spiritual teaching. And this is made more necessary by some of the misinformation that was really out there at the time. Here is something that someone wrote in 1895. Although the Theosophical Society was founded at a comparatively recent date in 1875, yet its real origin has hitherto been lost in the darkness of mystery and obscurity. Its founders, Madame Blavatsky and Olcott, as well as its first adherents, did all in their power to raise as much fog as possible, in the thick folds of which it was easy to get stifled, but impossible to find the real cradle of the interesting infant, which was the fruit of the spiritual union of the Russian wanderer and the American colonel. Right? So there really was, and there still is, a great deal of misinformation about how this wonderful thing known as Theosophy came about. And this book, The Dawning of the Theosophical Movement, which was once introduced when I was speaking in India as the downing of the Theosophical Movement. I had to quickly correct them, no, dawning. Really, I really wanted to see what happened. And you know, our motto is, there is no religion higher than truth. This quest for truth or meaning or actuality is so much based in our presentation of Theosophy. And I wanted to really find out what happened. There are all sorts of mystical interpretations and mysterious happenings. But as you know, Colonel Olcott and Madame Blavatsky met in October 1874 at the Eddy farmhouse. At the time, there was really no great New Age spiritual occult movement as we know it. There was a mass movement, though, of spiritualism. Spiritualism, the adherents claim, perhaps, I've seen figures from 8 to 14 million Americans believed in spiritualism. That is, that the dead could communicate through the medium to those around them. And it was always a dead person was communicating with the living. Into this world, Madame Blavatsky, who had recently arrived in America, went to Vermont and met Colonel Olcott, who was doing a series of investigations at the Eddy farmhouse, which is a beautiful ski lodge today, so you can also visit it. Olcott says that when they met, his first act was to offer a light for her cigarette. He says that their relationship began in a fire, and it was this wonderful consuming fire, right? As you know, Madame Blavatsky smoked, which was highly irregular for women at that time. But they really made this connection. Both of them saw something in each other. Colonel Olcott was a well-known New York lawyer. I think if he had not met her, he would have gone on into New York politics, could have become an assemblyman, certainly. They began investigating spiritualism because science, the professors, the academics of their time wanted no part of this. And in his introduction to the founding of the society, in the little booklet that was founded with the objects, he said that science wouldn't investigate this particular thing. They could investigate the lifespan of a little beetle or a protozoa, but one of the most momentous things, whether a man or a woman lives after death, was totally dismissed. So he tried initially in the spring of 1875 to bring together a group of people who would really investigate the mediums. He tried all sorts of tests for them. One of the most remarkable is Mrs. Thayer, a medium who could manifest flowers. She would sit in the chair, and Colonel Olcott, through the piercings of her ear, had a piece of thread and attached to sealing wax on the chair so she couldn't really move or fake all these things. But it still didn't get the recognition he wanted to. So in September 7th in New York in 1875, during a lecture in one of Madame Blavatsky's rooms in Irving Place, the speaker was talking that he had found a way to materialize these elementals that lived in the atmosphere. And Colonel Olcott wrote a little note and passed it to Mr. Judge to pass to Madame Blavatsky, saying, wouldn't it be a good thing to form a society for this sort of research? Now, what exactly this sort of research is unclear, but actually research since I've done this book has proved that Colonel Olcott and Madame Blavatsky were actually doing research for the Imperial University of St. Petersburg. They were very keen and very aware of scientific methodology. This is a remarkable thing, and in fact, Arthur Conan Doyle, who is the creator of Sherlock Holmes, wrote in his own study of spiritualism that Colonel Olcott's methods were the most perfect scientific methodology he had seen. Imagine, the great creator of Sherlock Holmes, no less, taught that Olcott's own methodology was better than anything he had seen. So, sounds like a great idea. Of course, everybody there said, why not? Especially since they didn't have to do any work. They met after that. The Minute Book still exists. They decided to start this organization. A number of names were looked upon, but they settled by chance on the name of the Theosophical Society. It was suggested that maybe calling it the Occult Society, the Hermetic Society, but by chance, right, this name of the Theosophical Society was chosen, and I think they could not have chosen a better name to really define what it was all about, because Theosophy at that time really had no meaning, certainly not the meaning that is invested today. The idea of divine wisdom, the wisdom of the gods, the wisdom that is regenerating, something special. So they started this society, but of course they were trying to sort of continue on their investigation of mediums. And it really didn't peter out. And as Colonel Olcott said, by the end of 1875, the beginning of 1876, interest petered out until really meetings were no longer held. They gave up the hall they had rented, and it really resided with Colonel Olcott and Madame Blavatsky and a few other people. One of the stories I like to tell is that they even found it difficult to make a quorum to have a business meeting. Of course, at that time, to come from Brooklyn, New York to Manhattan was a long journey, so they deputed the chandelier as their third person to make a quorum. And as Colonel Olcott said, when they left New York, they paid adieu to one of the most famous and the most stalwart members who had been through thick and thin, their chandelier. Unfortunately, though, Madame Blavatsky at this time really didn't play a part. She attended a few meetings, but by October 1875, while the bylaws were being ironed out, the officers were being decided, she got up and went to Ithaca, New York to visit Professor Hiram Corson. He was a professor of English literature and rhetoric at Cornell University. If you haven't been to Cornell, it's a beautiful little university and probably has some of the best food in all of the Ivy League schools. I can testify to that. But she went up there and she started to write. She didn't know exactly what it was, but she just wrote and wrote. And we have some firsthand accounts. There is a wonderful archive of Professor Corson's papers at Cornell. In fact, I started this book by going up to Cornell because there was all of this material that hadn't really been looked at. And in those old days, I remember carrying a large portable typewriter, which would be insane today, and try to transcribe this material. But I'll give you some of the correspondence between Mrs. Corson and her son. Professor Corson had just lost his daughter. She died very young. And you could tell he really had this love for his daughter. And it gives us an insight why so many people were interested in spiritualism. Just the reassurance that somebody you had loved was all right. He had tried different mediums, and believing that Madame Blavatsky was a medium, asked her to come up. But as he wrote to his son, he says that Madame Blavatsky is still with us. She gives us a good deal of trouble, and we get very little from her in return, for she is occupied wholly with her own work. I expected that we should get some sittings together, sittings like a medium, but she is not only disposed, but decidedly opposed to anything of the kind. So imagine people who think she was a medium. She had this opportunity and, of course, had wanted no part of it, but all she would do is write. And Mrs. Corson wrote to her son, and she gives this little monologue with what happened. So this is Madame Blavatsky. Professor, I want you to listen to this. Professor Corson, I will if you stop this infernal smoking. I cannot and will not listen in the midst of all this agitation of puffing and lighting cigarettes. Madame Blavatsky, oh you, throws the cigarette in the fire, reads loud enough to be heard in the village in the midst of a sentence, raps at the other end of the room. They had wanted her to see the countryside around Cornell because it was early fall and it was really pretty. But they begged her not to smoke in public, which was considered a bit outre. And Mrs. Corson said, the poor woman promised more than she could keep. She had to get out of the carriage into the woods and take a few whiffs. So she planted herself on a log and sat there and had her cigarettes, though. So we get this impression of her. And then when she returns to New York, just keeps writing, which is a remarkable thing for somebody who really, imagine a woman in the 19th century who had no formal education, had been to no school, certainly not college, had never really written in English. Her first writings that we have in English are just from 2 years before, and yet sits down to write this monumental book that was eventually called Isis Unveiled. Her initial title was A Skeleton Key to Mysterious Gates. Of course, the publisher nixed that idea. Then it was going to be called The Veil of Isis, but they found that title had been taken, so they called it Isis Unveiled, though, as her editor pointed out, it was singularly inappropriate, considering the book had very little to do about Egypt and Egyptian religion. But imagine, Colonel Olcott said that literally she had not left her rooms for 6 months and just simply sat there day in and day out, writing. And then, of course, produces this remarkable book that really shows it's a wonderful argument that such a thing as the esoteric tradition exists. There had been previous attempts in antiquarian writing talking about ancient traditions and symbolism, but Isis is totally different because it presents esoteric philosophy as a living thing today. It is something that is still alive, still present. She goes through all of these things, science, theology, and ends up by advocating that there is this esoteric philosophy that is still in existence, and still in existence really in the East, because in the West religion prosecuted those who believed anything different than organized religion. The book is published in 1877 and sells out in 10 days. Imagine. It was reprinted that same year by the publisher and remained in print throughout the 19th century. It probably went through 8 or 9 editions. Was remarkably influential. Pretty well all the major figures of the esoteric movements of the 19th century read Isis Unveiled. It is one of the first examples of the use of the word occultism in English, though the word had existed in French, l'occultisme. But it's really remarkable, and as soon as it's finished, she announces to Colonel Olcott that she is going to go to India. Now, India at that time was not a place anyone in their right mind would go to for spirituality. India was a place that you sent missionaries, you sent educators, but the idea of going for spirituality was truly just unthinkable. And so they represent the first idea of this pilgrimage to India. As Professor Robert Elwood reminded me when I saw him last, Walt Whitman has a poem about passage to India, to what is beyond India itself. And she wrote early on that one single trip to the Orient, to the East, was worth years of book study, the idea of going to this other culture. So though the book ends with them going, I've just given you the Cliff Note version of the book, which I hope won't dissuade you from buying it because it's still available at 1987 prices. But it ends with Colonel Olcott and Madame Blavatsky arriving in India. And Colonel Olcott writes in his diary when he arrived in India, his first act was to literally touch the ground, to do puja. And his diary records that the occasion fairly brought water to my eyes. The long-awaited moment comes at last, and I am face to face with my spiritual kinsman. I think that's such a beautiful thing. You know, Colonel Olcott had two sons that he really loved, but he made this remarkable sacrifice. Both of them did. They were unsure of their sources of income. Madame Blavatsky supported herself by writing fiction for the Russian press, but they went to this totally unknown place, which was also quite an arduous trip. They went to England, and then from England, from Liverpool to Suez, through the Arabian Sea to Bombay. And of course, really lived, it's the India they saw is the India we know. Through their eyes, we still see India. Because as Blavatsky pointed out, unlike the British who were merely surrounded by India, they were seeing the real India, right? She points out that they stayed with Indians. They stayed in what was then known as Blacktown. You know, the English had these wonderful manicured places to stay in, and she ridicules them because they would wear full evening dress. She says, imagine in 100-degree heat, wearing full tuxedos, evening dress, and of course, drinking away with their pegs of soda and brandy and scotch. But she lived among Indians, traveled among Indians, and she felt it gave her this real insight into the heart of that country. There's a line that could be used from her. I remember it from N. Sri Ram about Annie Besant when she came to India, that she saw the real behind the actual, even when the actual had deteriorated. And I've always thought that's such a great line. It could really be used for HPB herself and Colonel Olcott and these early Theosophists. They saw the real behind the actual, even when the actual had deteriorated. And this is a time, they really arrived at a crucial moment in Indian history. It was a time when English education was being stressed. Macaulay, in his famous Minute of Education, had written that one single shelf of English literature was worth all the literature of the Orient. There was whole debates about what to teach Indians, to teach in English, Indian history, all of that was regarded as rank superstition. And yet Colonel Olcott traveled throughout that entire country, lecturing to Indians that they had this great heritage. They had this wonderful spirituality. One of his famous lines is, he talked about BAs, they were bad Aryans, MAs, mad Aryans, and that to revive this wonderful spirituality, and they said it was the first time that actually some of these Indians actually saw a white person. It was interesting that an American and a Russian, as opposed to the British who really ruled India with an iron thumb, the idea of insurrection in India was still very powerful during that time. And as I say, they thought by teaching people English and English history, this was the best thing possible. But here's Colonel Olcott going through remote villages. He has some wonderful passages about the bath under awful situations with all of these faces peering at you. He would arrive in a village, he would be a translator, they would set up 2 torches, and he said that all it would do is attract insects, so that by the end of his talk, his beard was covered with a mass of crawling insects. Simply sleep, wake up the next day, travel by a bullock cart, which was simply a cart pulled by a bull with no shocks or springs, could you imagine, through every kind of road or no road at all. But here this man traveled throughout that country, visited Sri Lanka, actually started Buddhist education for Sri Lankans. At that time, it was really missionary education that was the big thing. The missionaries had the hold. He started Ananda College, which has become one of the premier colleges in Sri Lanka. It has produced numerous prime ministers, journalists, and, as they say, cricketers, which is the big thing in India and Sri Lanka. It is regarded as one of the prime. A lot of his schools still exist, and they have become, from secondary schools, have become colleges and universities throughout Sri Lanka. He also got Buddhists in Sri Lanka, Buddhist weddings recognized, because before that time, if you were married in a Buddhist ceremony, you still had to go to a Christian church and register yourself. He got them Wesak, the day of Buddha's enlightenment, as a holiday for civil servants. He is still very much beloved in India, and in fact, every year on his death date, there are still articles in the Sri Lankan papers about him. Imagine at the time, there was 115 lodges throughout India and Sri Lanka. Now I've moved on past the book, so I'm giving you what would be the midday of the Theosophical Movement. So we've passed the dawning. I always wondered with this talk, with this title, yes, there would be a midday, would there be an evening of the Theosophical Movement? I always thought it was nice, but perhaps somewhat inappropriate if you followed the train of thought. But imagine 110 lodges throughout that country at a time when India was separate states and principalities, where they were divided by language, by caste. And it is really that in India, as Olcott said, the nucleus was formed in America, but it really gestated in India, because this is where the objects as we see them, at least during their time period, especially that object to form a universal brotherhood regardless of race, creed, caste, sex, or color, really develops. Because even in India, people of different castes didn't integrate. The British and the Indians didn't integrate. I had the good fortune in this life to meet many old Indians who had joined in the 20s and 30s, and I asked them, what was the thing that drew you to the Theosophical Society? And universally they said it was the only place where they were treated as equals by white people. It really was an apartheid society. So the idea of this India, the mythic image of India that they have, a unity of India, really was something that the Theosophical Society contributed to. It was the first all-India organization where there were lodges in each part of the country, and every year in December they would come to Adyar, where they eventually had their headquarters, and meet. And all these different people from all over India had a chance to talk, to discuss ideas, to talk about this great philosophy. one Indian member wrote that he was traveling through a remote part of the country, and he met a young man who was wearing a single Rudrakshatra bead, which is a devotional symbol, and asked why. And this person told him that he had heard that these people from America had come and were talking about the greatness of Indian civilization. So we really see at a time when things could have gone either way, they really rekindled that wonderful idea of Indian spirituality. Of course, by 1885, Madame Blavatsky leaves India, moves to Europe, and ends up in Würzburg. I won't go into all of the reasons why, but let us just say that a Society for Psychical Research in England did a report on her claiming that she was a fraud. She would be remembered as one of the greatest imposters of all time. And what does she do? You know, I will be having a talk, hopefully during convention, where I will talk about these people as spiritual types. And I think one of the greatest lessons I always got from her is this. Imagine she had been in England, in London in 1884, feted by everybody. Everyone wanted to meet her, poets. And a year later, she's totally ignored. The worst things are said about her. And what does she do but sit down and write and write and write and write this great book, The Secret Doctrine. And as she said, this will show them what a Russian spy can do. And I think that's one, here, imagine to be in the limelight, to be adored by everybody, and then literally a year later to be shunned. Her only companion at that time was Countess Wachtmeister, who was actually stopping just to visit her and ended up staying. Again, it's the repeat of Isis, where this woman is simply sitting there and writing and writing and writing all day long. Even Countess Wachtmeister said that she was getting stir-crazy. She would go out just to buy a bar of soap, and there HPB would be writing, writing, writing all day long. And when she writes, she doesn't even know how it's going to end. Most people know, but she would just write and write and write and write. And she wrote this remarkable book, The Secret Doctrine. And finally, when she's invited to come to London, the manuscript is over 3 feet high. And she gives it to them to look at and edit, and they say, well, it should be done over. And she tells them to go to hell and do whatever they want with it. And they make it into the secret doctrine that we know, with the stanzas and the commentary. I have an abridgment of Isis Unveiled, by the way, which is published through Quest Books, which I highly recommend. I was talking to Richard Smalley today, who is the editor of Quest. He did a full-page review of the abridgment of Isis Unveiled in Gnosis magazine when it came out. It's actually an excellent review, and it starts off by saying that in the Gnosis editorial office committee, in the office, they had the copy of Isis Unveiled, but a tag was in it after the first 10 pages, which was as far as they had gotten. When the book was being vetted here, they asked an old member, whether it was worth doing an abridgment of, and she said, this was somebody who had been a member for 40 years, she said that she's never read it. So I have a nice abridgment, but also an abridgment of The Secret Doctrine, which, unlike other editions, really focuses on her writings on symbolism. I think that's really one of her best areas, these writings on symbolism. We can talk about so many other areas, but her writings on occult symbolism really hold together quite well. The third part of The Secret Doctrine in each volumes are parts on science, but I don't think that she really wrote all of those. I think many people just put their ideas together to help her. So we are quite, imagine her only leisure in the evening was playing solitaire. She would write for, imagine, 12 hours. When I was younger, one is very naive, and I always thought, I want to be like HPB. But I didn't realize it would mean sitting for 10 to 12 hours each day, writing, writing, writing. I did a book for the Theosophical Publishing House at Adyar for her death centenary in 1991. And those of you who have ever written for long periods of time, I remember looking and seeing the indentation of my pen in my fingers. You would just write and write and write and write and write. it's funny because there are many Madame Blavatsky's. This is how she looked in New York. She was still a very attractive woman. But the HPB that we know, the serious teacher, really evolves through all of this trauma and heartache. If you read some of her letters at the time, she says she feels like a fly with its wings torn off. She didn't have a lot of happiness in her own life, but she simply worked herself to death. She gave and gave and gave to the society. She literally was the mother, the magna mater of our organization, and yet gave all of these ideas. Where did these ideas come from? She says, of course, through her teachers, her masters. It's through them that she owes everything. They are the ones who influence her, who have given her this teaching. But I think that's an overstatement because she really was well read. She knew the literature of the time. She was quite abreast of philosophical development. She certainly knew Darwin. She knew the different scientific theories were going on. But yet, to pull it all together in a cohesive way, that is the miracle. And even with the secret doctrine, she has a line in the preface about, she quotes Montaigne, that I have done nothing but brought a piece of string. She's brought you this wonderful bouquet of Eastern flowers, and all she's done is brought you the string that keeps it together. And that is her real achievement. So when we remember her, we remember the history of our movement. We are really hearkening back to great inspirational figures. We look back, and she is something that we can truly be proud of. She is ours, right? The world, she may belong to the world, but she really is ours. That ballsy broad from the Ukraine, no less. I'll end here because if you have any questions, because I love questions, as you know. Different people have asked me so many today, I don't think there's anything left. But if you have any questions on some of these ideas, I'd like to stop now and perhaps deal with them.
If you do have a question, please just put up your hand and I'll bring you the microphone because we would like to record the question being asked as well.
Don't all speak at once. Years ago I had a professor at Columbia University and he told us this story. He had taught in India and he would do his class and at the end of the class he would ask, is there any questions? And the room would be dead silent. And he talked to the vice chancellor of the university about this, and the vice chancellor said, well, if they know their material, they shouldn't have to ask questions. So I hope you won't be like them. I hope you will have some comments or questions or... Yes.
How did she select India? If she could have went anywhere in the world, why did she select India?
Because she thought of India as this great repository of spirituality. The American transcendentalists, this wasn't a new thing, the American transcendentalist Emerson Thoreau talked about the East, but the East was this sort of misty watercolor memories, of this sort of East that started at Suez and then went all the way to China. She really focused on India, and her being there really helped develop a sense of national identity and consciousness. In fact, the Indian National Congress that worked eventually towards India's independence was started by a number of theosophists. Mrs. Besant, who became head of it, in fact, I used to say that she was the last European to head the Congress and the first woman to do so. But now, of course, with Sonia Gandhi, who is Italian and married to Rajiv Gandhi, there is another person who is a non-Indian who has become head of the Congress. But it worked toward the independence of that country. And Mrs. Besant's comment about India is the only place in existence where all the religions of the world live and are practiced. You will find, of course, Hinduism, you will find Islam. There are more Indians in India. There you will find the Buddhists. It is true, the Theosophists, that Buddhism had a revival in India. Buddhism had pretty well disappeared from India. And through members like the Angarika Dharmapala, who had met HPB at the age of 14 and just was totally smitten with her, he wanted to go to the Himalayas and be with the masters, and she told him to study Pali. And he really helped start a society for the promotion of Buddhism.
I think we have a question from the web.
It's written in, given the now extraordinary interest today in science and theosophy, would you have written your abridgment today differently over symbolism?
No, I would not. You know, when you do these books are all my children, so to speak. When I am gone and the personality is meaningless, these wonderful children will live on after me. And to a great extent, they write themselves. I must tell you, I did the abridgment of Isis in the same building that HPB lived in the Lamasery. I used to live, when I lived in New York, I lived in the Lamasery itself. And when I did the abridgment of Isis, I never started out by saying, oh, I'm going to abridge Isis Unveiled. I happened to have the book there for some light evening reading. And I thought, well, I kept going through it, and I said, well, that part you could cross out, and that part. And it literally did itself. It was done in 3 months, that abridgment. It took 3 years to track down all the citations, imagine. It just simply did itself. So no, these books, to an extent, do themselves. An abridgment isn't a rearrangement of the material, but you are able to see, okay, this point connects to this point that connects to here. And sometimes she gives many, explanations to show that she's not invented this material. Remember, in the 19th century, this was all terribly new. So she had to show that she didn't invent it, that this person talks about it and the Neoplatonists talk about it. But if you look at the philosophy behind it, it tallies with the Neoplatonist philosophy. It tallies with a lot of Indian philosophy. I must point out one specific thing. As you know, Madame Blavatsky is not a creationist, that the world wasn't created out of something. There's nothing and then something. You might be able to call her philosophy emanationism, which was used by the Neoplatonists, which is used in the Upanishads. They give the example of a spider spinning a web out of itself. So the universe as we know it isn't unrelated to the absolute. But she has even defined this even further. She refers to it as not even emanationism, that creation is a radiation of the absolute, and to an extent that all that exists has already existed, right? There's truly, the universe doesn't create anything because then it would be imperfect. Everything that has ever existed is there. It is like shining a light. In fact, today is the anniversary of the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. And they said when Lord Carnarvon and Carter shone that first light into this tomb, it dazzled with gold. So in a sense, all possibilities, the divine has all possibilities there. And creation is just a light to show you one aspect of that possibility. Because in the divine, everything is there. If it had to create something else, it would be imperfect because it didn't have this. So how could it be absolute? So all of creation, all possibilities, all ramifications exist. There's a wonderful line in The Secret Doctrine about the eternity of the pilgrim is like a wink in the eye of self-existence. That the whole creation of this universe that we think is billions and millions of years is just one divine thought made manifest, right? In the beginning was the Word. So all of this is just the divine thought. Or have you ever seen this in a pool where a bubble of air suddenly surfaces and it's iridescent and it shines and then pops? It's just this wonderful moment, the divine reflecting on itself, of which we are all part and parcel. As you know, one of the great things she gives us is this wonderful idea of occult anthropology, the development of humanity. And that truly you don't find anywhere else. That the individual, by our developing mind, manas, this wonderful thing that we have, a mind to embrace the universe, which is what the stanzas call it, that the humanity is rare because we have the ability to appreciate the creation. Animals may exist and they may look, but they want to eat and do other things. You don't see them meditating or saying, oh, what a beautiful world. You know, they're caught up in the process. But humanity has this wonderful ability to wonder. If you look at children, children are always full, everything is a delight to them. It's always new and fresh. It is only as we get older that we have become stale and not the world. So to be able to have this wonder, this wonderful transcendence, to see this dynamic living universe of which we are part and parcel. Remember, at the core of your being is that dynamic, vital possibility. Potential exists in you. And I think part of the work of Theosophists is to bring potentiality into actuality, right? To make the dreams of a better world perfect. And as we all know, in the Secret Doctrine and her writings, all change starts from within. So the thought is created, and then she refers to them as the architects, and then you get the builders. Of course, as she points out, you know, there are many different ways of interpreting any ancient scripture. It could be literal. So when we read something, when we read the Secret Doctrine, it is actually telling us about a process that existed. It could be symbolic. It's actually allegorical, telling us something else, what we would call psychology today. Or another aspect is even interacting with the text, it has a transformed nature. By simply turning our attentions, you know, people say, oh, why are her books so difficult? Well, you know, the Mahatmas, if they're Mahatmas, could have written anything is easy. But by us struggling to understand, to know, we are developing that Buddhic function, not only mind, manas, we are taking mind to a higher aspect. We are like those first fish that laboriously crawled out of the water. And by struggling, by challenging ourselves, by the search for meaning, we are really developing, and since humanity is all one, we are really affecting the whole consciousness of humanity. As you know, symbolically, the planet, which is one of her first ideas, has also 7 different aspects, and of which humanity is the manifestation of manas on the planet. So there's the vegetative nature, animals represent kama manas, but humanity itself represents not only the monastic part, and of course the masters would represent buddhi manas, and of course devas are buddhi, that we have a part and parcel to play in the evolution. There is that interconnectedness between us and the world around us. We are not separate from the world.
Michael, I'd like to see if you could go back to the early days again and tell us a little bit more about Olcott, say in New York. Maybe tell us about the Miracle Club. Tell us about perhaps some of the communication that he was getting in his education in Theosophy.
Truly, Colonel Olcott was a remarkable person. He his background was through agricultural reform. He had started a model farm. He did research in agriculture. He was an editor for one of the New York papers on agriculture. We refer to him as Colonel Olcott, but there really is no evidence. In the National Archives, there is no evidence that he actually enlisted. At that time, they would have civilians who could be aides to somebody. But he wasn't given that. He was given the title of colonel for his work for the War Department, fleshing out fraud and government corruption. So they gave him the title of colonel so he would have some standing in this research. And as you well know, he was called to Washington at the assassination of President Lincoln to be part of the investigative committee. He was a prominent New York lawyer, as I said at that time. But then suddenly got interested by reading the accounts in the spiritualist press, and he thought this was really a dynamic thing. At that time, you all, when I say the word medium, we all have some mental impression of it. But at that time, initially it started by rapping. These Fox sisters in upstate New York, they were sitting around and there would be this rapping, and it must have been a long, laborious process to spell out the alphabet. Is it A? Is it B? Well, of course, they didn't have television or radio, so they would go through the entire alphabet just to try to create, they called it the celestial telegraph. So that was one aspect, but by the 1870s, there was this full-form materialization. And in fact, the Dawning has a rare picture of one of these full forms that Colonel Olcott saw of Katie King. Here you can see this, which was actually a picture taken by Professor Crooks of the materialized spirit of Katie King. So there was this full form materialization. Out of the medium would come this full form, this ectoplasm. And he researched this. Then, of course, in the spring of 1875, started this Miracle Club where he wanted people to really test it according to empirical methods. And there was a certain interest among some scientists, but it really, Professor Alfred Wallace, who was one of the developers of the theory of natural selection, was very interested in spiritualism. But the scientific community took no interest in it, and so that petered out. So the idea, and in fact, Mahatma letters, they keep referring to, they don't want it to be another miracle club, the Theosophical Society. So our investigation of all of these matters, you can say the basis of our movement has this investigation. What is now the third object was probably their primary thing, to investigate the powers latent in the individual, to test those things, to find out which was true. And it was this wonderful synchronicity between these two people who really hit it off, who really had a wonderful relationship. There are many spiritual groups, many occult groups, but regardless of the problems of our society and our movement, we have never faced the problems. There's no talk about malfeasance of funds, things like that. Colonel Olcott labored for Theosophy till the day he died in February 17, 1907. And when he died at Adyar, the religious people from all the different groups came to pay tribute to him. A Buddhist priest, they chant over his cremation, a Zoroastrian. He was actually invested with a sacred thread of the Hindus, which is really rare. These people were quite remarkable. Certainly if the masters exist, they couldn't have chosen a better person than Olcott. But if people who knew him in 1875, who would have thought that he had that ability to not only form the society, but keep it through its course for all of his life, for over a quarter century. That potential was there. Again, this potential. Truly, they saw that potential in him, and he went to Japan. He just went everywhere. That man traveled constantly. But he found himself in Theosophy. And this is the thing, hopefully many of you will find yourself in Theosophy.
We have another question from online. This one's from Marina. Even with all the words she gave us in the secret doctrine, in the end, she seems to be encouraging us to live fully in each moment with the highest integrity. Can you give us some concrete ways we can live in the Buddhic with highest integrity and so live in each moment?
That's a very tender trap, to live in the moment, I must tell you. And in fact, one of the things of modern culture, people now just live in the moment. They know there's going to be no safety net for them. Young people especially live really in the moment. They know there's going to be no safety net, that they may work till they're 80. The world may blow up around them. You can die at any moment. So they are really living in the moment. They're like the lilies of the field that neither care about the future, but when they have to face, living as an older person and you haven't saved up. It's like the Aesop fable about the ant and the grasshopper who didn't save up. Yes, to be I would say not so much living in the moment, but to be aware of the significance of each moment. If you are living in the moment, you are just, it's a very self-centered thing. It's just the now. And as you know, this has become the mantra of our time, the power of now. But then what happens after? If you're just living in the now, you really wouldn't develop a lot of things. You'd be so now. And those of you who have been to India know that they live in the now. So there's really no great ecological movement because why bother? It's all Maya. Why bother? So I would say, I would translate that into realizing the significance of each moment. Because truly there is only one moment. There is a wonderful line in The Secret Doctrine. There are many, I think one of the things the abridgment does is bring out some of those key ideas. And here's perhaps your reply. Time, this is the comment on stanza number 1. Time is only an illusion produced by the succession of our states of consciousness as we travel through eternal duration. She has these 3 aspects of the absolute: duration. Pablo, you remember the others? Duration.
Movement and space.
Yes, there you go. Time is only an illusion produced by the succession of our states of consciousness as we travel through eternal duration. It does not exist where no consciousness exists. Nothing on earth has real duration, for nothing remains without change or the same for the billionth part of a second. The sensation we have of the actuality of the division of time known as present comes only from the blurring of that momentary glimpse or succession of glimpses of things that our senses give us, as those things pass from the region of ideals, which we call the future, to the region of memories that we name the past. The real person or thing does not consist solely of what is seen at any particular moment, but is composed of the sum of all its various and changing conditions. I think that's a great idea. That truly, yes, we do only have this moment, but to be aware of the significance of the moment. I think living in the moment is a really easy way of just not even having to do anything. You're just living now, and there it is.
Michael, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the very different personalities that Blavatsky had from Alcott, and how the fact that their personalities were so different that helped them to work together as colleagues for so many years.
Sure, but you'll have to come to the convention in July because that will be the nature of my talk. And of course, let me give you a shameless plug because one of the things I will be doing there, those of you who are interested in history, I will be offering a workshop on writing your own lodge history to help you with the techniques. As I say, our history is a truly wonderful and remarkable thing, and it really can teach you so many things. And I've been stressing to our president, perhaps we shall have a history conference one of these centuries or years. But, so that question will be answered. So I want to give you, so you will have to come in July and hopefully ask me that then.
No, just mention, you said that our organization never had a problem with money and fraud in that sense. And actually, when the Miracle Club didn't work out because the medium wanted to earn money from that, and Blavatsky was very opposed, and she said, forget this whole endeavor because we are not earning money with spirituality.
Yes, and then it's ironic because, it was out of Colonel Olcott's pocket that the dues were when people didn't pay. In fact, when they audited the society in the 1880s, they found that Colonel Olcott and Madame Blavatsky were the largest contributors to it. Technically, Olcott kept paying out of his own pocket till he really couldn't anymore.
Thank you. Well, this is going to be perhaps a note to end up your night. I would like you to comment, and I apologize, I have never read neither one of your books, but I'm just 30, so I have many more years to read. So I promise to read at least one. But I don't know if you have written something regarding the aspects that really highlight and make a giant out of HPV, rather her psychical or psychic abilities or medium colossal capabilities that she had. What were those true deep qualifications she had embodied from previous lifetimes up to that one, which also Olcott had?
Mm-hmm.
The reason why the master shows them both to carry on upon their shoulders this great endeavor of founding the Theosophical Society. Thank you.
Those of us who are involved in the Theosophical movement today, we are the embodiment of their hope and dream. We are why they started this. Madame Blavatsky, when she would constantly be writing, and she had this thing where she would just stop and sort of gaze into space. And I always wondered if she would be looking to see us. We are the embodiment. We are the hope and dream of these individuals. The remarkable thing that both Olcott and Blavatsky had was unswerving devotion to their teachers. And this, in fact, Blavatsky says that is her only means of reason for success. And Mrs. Besson said that Madame Blavatsky once told her that if the master wanted it, she'd walk naked through Trafalgar Square, which is the big square in England, and the idea of Madame Blavatsky walking naked anywhere. But they had this unswerving devotion, commitment, and loyalty to this thing. Once it started, can you imagine a movement where they couldn't even get a third person? All of us would have just given up. But what is the true basis of success is that we just keep doing it and doing it and doing it, Like a Grandma Moses, still at the age of 90, are we doing it for recognition, or are we doing it because the thing itself is worth doing? They believed in it. Aside from the phenomena and all that, it's very hard to really see Madame Blavatsky. We are, to a great extent, are seeing her through Colonel Olcott's eyes. And Colonel Olcott, I don't think, ever outgrew that phenomenal part of it. He loved phenomena. In fact, Blavatsky always teased him about this. But everything became phenomena. And there could have been many rational explanations. And of course, I think she did a lot to entertain him, to keep him on track. But I would say the remarkable thing is this true, unswerving devotion to the cause of truth. And has been a qualification of all of our great people, because we mentioned before about, few covet the philanthropist's lot, few covet its crown of thorns, few, are able to wear it. And, what did she get out of it? Really nothing. You think of all these people, they worked themselves to death, but they believed in it. They believed that it had a purpose, that it could truly help and regenerate humanity. That was the bottom line. Sometimes I always wonder, I'll give you an example. In the Lotus Sutra, which is this great Buddhist sutra that is known throughout Asia, and there's a story about a man who goes home, a very wealthy man who goes home and finds that his house is on fire and his children are inside. And these children are so young that even if he said, children, the house is on fire, either they might not understand or he actually go further in the burning building. So he says, children, I brought you some wonderful ponies and carts and toys. And the children come out. And the Buddha says, the man is the Buddha, this world is the burning building, and we are the children. So to you, it's a chapter called Expedient Means, to use this phenomena to draw us, right? We are so caught up in material things. So that is the hook to draw us out of this burning building and to be aware of suffering humanity. Remember, Our prime directive, to live to benefit mankind, is the first step. To live to benefit mankind is the first step. Now, as Blavatsky pointed out, we all have limited resources. Some of us are called to do good works. But when we turn our attention to these things, we are actually stimulating humanity. Since remember, truly all of humanity is one. This idea of human separateness, we must get over that, because all human hearts beat. We are all human in this world, except perhaps you over there. Not you, John, but that one over there is not that one with the turban over there is definitely not human. But you know, we share this commonality. To quote again one of the great American philosophers, you know, there's so much that we share that it's time we're aware it's a small world after all, which was the Disney World from the 1964 World's Fair. There's so much that we share that it's time we're aware it's a small world after all. And the remarkable thing about Theosophy is most groups, they only care about the people within the group. You know, regardless of imagine how revolutionary this was, regardless of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. We recognized the commonality of each human being, the dignity of each human being. And those ideals, of course, Gandhi, as you well know, was led to read the Bhagavad Gita by two of her students and embody those ideas in his own philosophy. Regardless if you were the lowest person of the lowest caste, you still had a certain dignity. And of course, through Gandhi, Martin Luther King became interested in those ideas. And so ideas rule the world. You know, there's a line in the Mahatma letters, he claimed that it's plagiarized, but I don't care, it still works. I don't care where they got it from, that ideas rule the world. And as men's minds awaken to new ideas, change will come. So we are the forerunners of this new world of being, this new continent of thought that will hopefully help all of humanity. Because let me tell you, human suffering is an awful, awful thing. None of you have passed through this world without some taste of it. And really, individual suffering is a wonderful thing because you learn empathy for another person. Once you have tasted that cup of suffering, you really know what other people are going through, that you are not alone. You know, the famous Buddhist story about the woman who comes to the Buddha with her dead child, she's still clinging to it, and the Buddha tells her to get a mustard seed from a house where there has been no death. And she goes through the entire town and realizes that her condition is not that unique. But human suffering, you know, those great ones who stand behind this movement, they are not only masters of wisdom, but they are masters of compassion. You know, the early members who talked about being in their presence, they were just humbled and abashed by the quality of their compassion. There's a line in Light in the Path that the difference between you and the sinner is not as great as the difference between you and the master, right? These great ones have truly attuned themselves for human suffering. And so then why would we cause suffering when we're supposed to be helping them relieve suffering? So, in fact, one of the best lines I've seen in all their letters, the greatest obligation and the foremost consolation of life is not to cause suffering. And I think that really embodies it, you know. And there's so much division in this world, so much hatred. As Theosophists, we can be there to help those who need. I always have given the story about the man who falls on the path of life. It's a wonderful story. Jesus is asked, who is my neighbor? He's asked by a lawyer, no less. You know, there's always a person in the audience who has a clever question, right? And he's asked, who is my neighbor? And Jesus tells him the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is very allegorical. A man falls on the path of life, right? He's attacked by three bandits. And of course, in Buddhism, it's anger, hatred, greed, lust. So a person falls on the path of life. The spiritual teacher sees him and literally crosses the road and walks on. The man from his own background sees him and also moves on and probably goes to town and said, "Do you see what happened to so-and-so? You know, oh, I saw him lying on the road. He was probably drunk." The Samaritan comes along, and the Samaritans were at the edge of, they were people who were shunned from the social order. The Samaritan sees him, takes him up, puts him on the mule, takes him to the inn, says, "This man needs help," and moves along. And then Jesus says in the parable, who acted as your neighbor in this story, right? But, the one who was there for you. So each of us have to be good Samaritans of humanity. We are part of the Red Cross of humanity in a sense. We are there, before I end, I'll just tell you the story that I always use. We talk about the teaching and all of this stuff, but there's a story about St. Francis who told a novice, they were in the monastery, and St. Francis said, "We are going to go into town and teach today." So they walked out of the monastery and they went down the hill and they came to the outskirts of the town, started walking through the lanes, and then found themselves in the city square, and then found they were walking back toward the monastery. And the novice said to St. Francis, "I thought we were going to teach today." And St. Francis said, "We have. By your own example," right? Nobody wants a grouchy guru, I can tell you that much. By your own example, by the light that you have within you, we really are there, to be there of assistance to another person, to the person in need, to the person who has shed a tear. We are so, so fortunate. I keep repeating this over and over. At least we have that glimmer of hope that can rationalize all of these things. But think of all of the people in the world who don't have that, who live in desperation, who live in darkness. And part of our work is to keep that beacon alive. I did an interview with the editor of the Quest magazine, and this is how I ended it, and I will end it here also. Are there any questions there? Okay. And it was a question about where do you see the Theosophical Movement at present, and what kind of future does it have? And I replied that I think we are in one of the most exciting periods in the history of the movement. To an extent, the Society's outer work to educate the world that such a thing as Theosophy exists is done. Hopefully, the movement will become a smaller and more cohesive inner group that works to uphold the beacon light of Theosophy in an ever-changing world. The opportunity to be part of history lies before each of us. So, on that note, thank you, and I'll see you in July. And as I say, for those of you who are interested in history, we will be having a workshop on writing your own lodge history, because I must say, they've done wonderful work here in preserving our history. You can't write about something unless you have the materials to do it. And our history is so rich, and local history is so rich, but so much of it is passing away. We have great resources in people who are the only link with what happened, what drew you. In fact, and perhaps something you might think about here, the last survey of members of the society of what religious group you were in was done in 1923 for Alvin Boyd Kuhn's thesis, which was done at Columbia University. The Theosophical Society sent out a survey to its members about your denomination, what led you to the society, what you thought was well. And so perhaps something like that could be done again, because it was a tremendous resource. And that's the only thing we have about what drew people, what background they came from. We really don't know. So enough about me. Thank you so much, and thank you again.